We can't seem to manage the floor as well as we sometimes can manage the committee on that. But we're going to proceed with the hearing on National Security and Foreign Affairs Subcommittee, Iran, Reality, Options, and Consequences, Part 2, entitled Negotiating with the Iranians, Missed Opportunities and Paths Forward. I ask unanimous consent that only the chairman and ranking member of the subcommittee be allowed to make opening statements, that the gentleman from Virginia, Congressman Jim Moran, be allowed to participate in this hearing, and that the record be kept open for 5 business days so that all members of the subcommittee be allowed to submit a written statement for the record without any objection on all so ordered. I just want to welcome you again. I'm going to forego most of my opening statement in the interest of asking you folks to put your testimony on record, and then as members come back from the vote, we can hopefully have some questions and answers. I just note that this is a hearing that happens at a time when a lot of saber-rattling and bellicose invective has been going on. I think it's appropriate for us to try to get a thoughtful and comprehensive approach to what's happening in Iran, about their people and society, about recent history and diplomacy, what lessons we can learn, and possibly what consequences of any actions that might be proposed or considered. So hopefully we'll do all this before any irreversible decisions are made, and this hearing is designed to move us in that direction. The rest of my statement I'll place on the record, and at this point, it's give the other members a chance to have their opening statements, the ranking member at least when he shows up. In the meantime, our panel today is composed of Ambassador James Dobbins, Hilary Mann Leverett, Flint Leverett, Larry Hass, and Suzanne Maloney. Our first witness will be Ambassador James Dobbins, who was the Bush administration's first special envoy for Afghanistan and was intensely involved in talks with Iran concerning Afghanistan. Ambassador Dobbins has extensive diplomatic and negotiating experience, including having served as special U.S. envoy to Somalia, Haiti, Bosnia, and Kosovo. Ambassador Dobbins, we'd love to hear from you, please. You have 5 minutes, but your written remarks will be placed on the record. So if you want to deviate from that, that's fine with us. We'll try to be a little lenient with the 5-minute thing, but also respectful of your all time for being here and having so much of it already passed by. Ambassador. Ambassador, I'm going to interrupt you. I was just reminded that we have a policy in this committee to swear our witnesses in. So if all of you would please rise and raise your right hand. Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? Yep. The record will reflect that all the members have answered the affirmative, and I thank you for that. Ambassador Dobbins.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for holding these important hearings. There's a popular perception in the United States that in the aftermath of 9/11, the United States formed a coalition and overthrew the Taliban. That's wrong. In the aftermath of 9/11, the United States joined an existing coalition which had been trying to overthrow the Taliban for most of a decade. That coalition consisted of India, Russia, Iran, and the Northern Alliance. And it was with the additional assistance of American air power that that coalition succeeded in ousting the Taliban. That coalition, along with Pakistan, was also very important to the success that the United States enjoyed in replacing the Taliban within a matter of weeks with a moderate, broadly representative government in Kabul, which relieved the United States of the necessity of itself occupying and trying to govern Afghanistan. All of those countries, and in particular, given the subject of this committee hearing, Iran, were particularly helpful in the diplomacy that led to the creation of the Karzai government. And in my written testimony, I provide some detail and some anecdotes which flesh out the nature of that cooperation and the degree to which it was indeed critical to the success of American diplomacy in the last months of 2001. In January of 2002, the President, in his inaugural address, included Iran in what he characterized as an axis of evil. Despite that, the Iranians persisted for a number of months in offering significant cooperation to the United States. For instance, in March of 2002, the Iranian delegation asked to meet with me on the fringes of an international meeting in Geneva that I was chairing on assistance to Afghanistan. They introduced me to an Iranian general in full uniform who had been the commander of their security assistance efforts to the Northern Alliance throughout the war. The general said that Iran was willing to contribute to an American-led program to build the new Afghan National Army. We're prepared to house and train up to 20,000 troops in a broader program under American leadership, the general offered. Well, if you train some Afghan troops and we train some, might they not end up having incompatible doctrines? I responded, somewhat skeptically. The general just laughed. He said, "Don't worry, we're still using the manuals you left behind in 1979. I said, okay, well, they might have compatible doctrines, but might not have conflicting loyalties. Well, he responded, we trained, we equipped, and by the way, we're still the ones who are paying the Afghan troops you're using in southern Afghanistan to chase down the remaining Taliban and al-Qaeda elements. Are you having any difficulty with their loyalty? I acknowledged that insofar as I was aware, we did not, and I said I'd report the offer back to Washington. Now, this offer struck me as problematic in detail, but promising in overall implications. Despite the general's assurances, I could foresee problems in having Iran and the United States both training different components of the same Afghan army. On the other hand, Iranian participation under American leadership in a joint program of this sort would be a breathtaking departure after more than 20 years of mutual hostility. It also represented a significant step beyond the quiet diplomatic cooperation we had already achieved. Clearly, despite having been relegated by President Bush to the axis of evil, the Khatami government wanted to deepen its cooperation with Washington and was willing to do so in the most overt and public manner. I went back, I reported these overtures to Washington. There was no apparent interest in discussing them, and as far as I'm aware, the Iranians never got a response. There were, however, continued discussions with the Iranians, and a year later, in the aftermath of the American invasion of Iraq, the Iranian government again came forward with an even more sweeping offer, one that the witness sitting next to me will, I think, be able to talk about in a little more detail. Now, it's not a coincidence that both of these Iranian overtures came in the aftermath of an American intervention on their borders. In both cases, those American moves left the Iranian regime both grateful and fearful. They were grateful that the United States had taken down two of their principal regional antagonists, and they were fearful that they might be next, seeing as they did American troops to their north, based in Central Asia, to their east in Afghanistan, to their south in the Gulf, and to their west in Iraq. They were surrounded. Unfortunately, if the Iranian regime was feeling grateful and fearful, the American government, and frankly not just the government, but the American country, people, Congress as a whole, were feeling supremely self-confident. In late 2001, we had overthrown Mullah Omar in a lightning campaign, and then in 2003, we had done the same thing with Saddam. We were on a roll, acutely conscious of being the world's only superpower. There seemed nothing America could not accomplish. I suspect that the administration, therefore, saw no rush in responding to these Iranian overtures. As Afghanistan was stabilized and Iraq was democratized, the American position could only grow stronger. In good time, Washington could deal with the Iranian regime. Tehran's offers were becoming steadily better. Why not wait for another year or two? Of course, events did not move in that direction. Since the last Iranian overtures of 2002, it is Tehran's position that has strengthened and hardened. In contrast, Washington's position has weakened and hardened. America's difficulties in Iraq are the principal cause of this shift. Americans are fond of characterizing the Iranian regime as a fundamentalist theocracy. The truth is more complex. Iran isn't Switzerland, but it is rather more democratic than Egypt and less fundamentalist than Saudi Arabia, two of America's most important allies in the region. Iranian women vote, drive automobiles, attend university in large numbers, and lead successful professional lives. Iran's parliament and president are popularly elected. Elections take place on schedule. The outcomes are not foreordained. The results do make a difference, perhaps not as much of a difference as we would like, but enough to make the process worth understanding a good deal better than we do. Even the supreme leader is elected to a fixed, renewable term by a council of clerics who are in turn popularly elected by universal adult suffrage. The last election to that body was a setback for President Ahmadinejad. Presidential elections produce even more meaningful swings, as can those in the parliament. Yes, the system is rigged, but not to the point that it becomes a complete sham, as in the case with many other Middle Eastern elections when such are held at all. In my judgment, Mr. Chairman, it's time to apply to Iran the policies which won the Cold War, liberated the Warsaw Pact, and reunited Europe. Policies of détente and containment, communication where possible, and confrontation whenever necessary. We spoke to Stalin's Russia. We spoke to Mao's China. In both cases, greater mutual exposure changed their system, not ours. It's time to speak to Iran unconditionally and comprehensively. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. Our second witness, Ms. Hillary Mann Leverett, directly participated in negotiations with Iran on behalf of the United States government from 2001 to 2003. Shortly after 9/11, 2001, she was tapped to serve as the Iran expert on the National Security Council. She's a career Foreign Service officer. Her service includes positions at the National Security Council with the U.S. mission to the United Nations and a special assistant to the United States ambassador in Cairo, Egypt. From 1996 to 1998, she was a terrorism fellow at the Washington Institute of Near East Policy, and has in the past been a Fulbright Scholar and a Watson Fellow. Speaks Arabic and has a great academic background as well. Ms. Leverett, would you care to address us for 5 minutes?
Okay, sorry about that. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Just before you start, I'm
Yes,
going to ask unanimous consent of the committee that Mr. McDermott be allowed to sit in and participate under the committee's rules as well. It already has been done. And without objection, so ordered. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for inviting me here today. Iran's geostrategic location at the crossroads of the Middle East and Central Asia and in the heart of the Persian Gulf, enormous hydrocarbon resources, and historic role make it a critical country for U.S. interests. However, since the advent of the Islamic Republic in 1979, Iran has worked against U.S. interests on a number of fronts. As a result, every U.S. administration since 1979 has sought to isolate and contain Iran. Yet Iran's undeniable importance in the Middle Eastern balance of power and in many areas of importance to the United States has prompted every U.S. administration, the Reagan, George H.W. Bush, Clinton, and George W. Bush administrations, to explore some kind of opening to Iran either through tactical cooperation or by testing the waters publicly. I was directly involved in the Bush administration's efforts to engage Iran over Afghanistan, Al-Qaeda, and Iraq, both shortly before and after the 9/11 attacks, and I will get to that in a moment. What I want to emphasize at the outset of my testimony is that Iran's tactical cooperation with every U.S. administration since 1980 was fundamentally positive in character. Iran delivered much, not all, but much of what we asked. Furthermore, and especially with regard to post-9/11 cooperation over Afghanistan, Iran hoped and anticipated that tactical cooperation with the U.S. would lead to a genuine strategic opening between our two countries. In most cases, however, it was the U.S. that was unwilling to sustain and build upon tactical cooperation to pursue true strategic rapprochement. I will spell out this argument through the prism of my own experience in the current Bush administration. In late spring 2001, I was a U.S. Foreign Service officer at the U.S. mission to the UN in New York, responsible for dealing with Afghanistan. In that capacity, I was authorized to work with my Iranian counterpart as part of the 6+2 diplomatic process that had been set up by the UN to deal with the threats Afghanistan posed to the international community even before 9/11. My Iranian counterpart and I worked openly and constructively on a wide range of Afghan-related issues, including the enforcement of an arms embargo on the Taliban regime, counter-narcotics initiatives, and humanitarian relief for Afghan refugees, 2 million of whom were in Iran. On 9/11, I was scheduled to meet with my Iranian counterpart to discuss how to make sure that counterterrorism was the centerpiece of a draft statement of principles for an upcoming 6+2 foreign ministers meeting at the UN in New York. Instead, the World Trade Center was attacked, and I was evacuated from my office at the U.S. mission. My Iranian counterpart called to express in his words, his horror at what he thought was an Al-Qaeda terrorist attack on the United States. Without hesitation, he said the Iranian people and the Iranian government would be condemning this horrible attack on the U.S. and the entire civilized world. Within days, the Iranian government did come out to strongly condemn the attack, and thousands of Iranians took to the streets in Tehran in candlelight vigils to mourn those who had perished in the U.S. Even Iran's supreme leader, Ali Khamenei, took the extraordinary step of unequivocally condemning Al-Qaeda and its attack on the U.S. in a Friday prayer sermon that was broadcast to tens of millions of Iranians and Shiite followers throughout the Middle East. For the first 2 months after 9/11, I worked openly and intensively with my Iranian counterpart to establish a framework for U.S.-Iranian cooperation on Afghanistan. My Iranian counterpart said that Iran was prepared to offer unconditional cooperation to the U.S. Iran would not ask the U.S. for anything up front in return for its cooperation over Afghanistan. As I document in my written testimony, in the months after 9/11, Iran provided tangible support to U.S. and coalition military operations in Afghanistan and robust support to U.S. efforts to stand up a post-Taliban political order, culminating in the Bonn Conference, which my colleague Jim Dobbins led the U.S. delegation to. Following the Bonn Conference and my transfer from the UN to the National Security Council to become Director for Iran and Afghanistan Affairs, the U.S. and Iran launched an ongoing channel of monthly meetings to coordinate our efforts on Afghanistan and related issues. I was one of 2 U.S. officials who consistently participated in those discussions, which lasted for 17 months. The other was Ryan Crocker, now our ambassador in Iraq. As I document in my testimony, the Iranians provided considerable assistance to bolster the pro-American Karzai government in Afghanistan and on counterterrorism, including deporting hundreds of al-Qaeda and Taliban figures seeking to flee Afghanistan to or through Iran. The Iranians skipped 1 monthly meeting to protest President Bush's public condemnation of Iran as part of the Axis of Evil in January 2002, but otherwise they came to every monthly meeting over the 17-month course of the talks. It is important to emphasize that in the monthly meetings, my Iranian counterparts repeatedly raised the prospect of broadening our common agenda, both to achieve a strategic rapprochement between the U.S. and Iran, as well as to provide tactical support to a prospective U.S. attack on Saddam's Iraq. The prospect of rapprochement with Iran had been explicitly rejected by the President and his senior national security team. Whether we could have substantive discussions to coordinate on Iraq became subject to whether Iran would turn over the remaining handful of al-Qaeda operatives they had detained in Iran. But the Iranians first expressed an inability to find the remaining al-Qaeda suspects we identified without any information from us as to their whereabouts. And later, the Iranians expressed an unwillingness to relinquish these last quote-unquote cards without assurances from us that we would not use the Iranian opposition group, the MEK, and its armed forces in Iraq against Iran. Although we provided Iran with assurances about the MEK in January and February 2003, after all, they were a designated terrorist organization by the U.S. government. The Iranians were still concerned by the words and actions of senior Pentagon officials and later U.S. occupation forces in Iraq, who not only refused to disarm MEK forces in Iraq, but also designated the U.S. as protected persons under the Geneva Convention in order to prevent their deportation by the Iraqis to Iran, even though the MEK had been designated by us as a foreign terrorist organization. Therefore, by the spring of 2003, the dialogue was at an impasse. It is in this context that one should evaluate the Iranian offer to negotiate a comprehensive resolution of differences with the United States. With the bilateral channel at an impasse, Tehran sent this offer in early May 2003 through Switzerland, the U.S. protecting power in Iran, as Secretary Rice and former administration officials have acknowledged. Everything in the offer, everything would be on the table, including Iran's material support for Hamas, for PIJ, for Hezbollah, as well as its nuclear ambitions and role in Iraq. But the Bush administration rejected this proposal out of hand and cut off the bilateral channel with the Iranians less than 2 weeks later. From an Iranian perspective, this record shows that Washington will take what it can get from talking to Iran on specific issues, but it is not prepared for real rapprochement. From an American perspective, I believe this record indicates that the Bush administration cavalierly rejected multiple and significant opportunities to put U.S.-Iranian relations on a fundamentally more positive and constructive trajectory. This mishandling of U.S. relations with Iran continues to impose heavy costs on American interests and policy efforts in the Middle East, on the Iranian nuclear issue in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in Lebanon, and in the Arab-Israeli arena. I want to note in closing that the White House has gone to extraordinary lengths, including outright abuse of executive powers, to keep me from laying out the full extent of the Bush administration's mishandling of Iran policy since the 9/11 attacks. In December 2006, I co-authored an op-ed for the New York Times on this topic, using material that my co-author had previously cleared through the CIA and had in fact published with CIA approval in several different places. When we submitted our joint op-ed draft for pre-publication review, my co-author was informed by a member of the CIA's pre-publication review board that the draft, in the CIA's judgment, contained no classified material. Similarly, I was informed by a career officer at the State Department involved in the review process that in the State Department's judgment, the draft contained no classified information. However, my co-author and I were told by the CIA and the State Department that the White House had complained about my co-author's previous publications criticizing the Bush administration's Iran policy and insisted on censoring whole paragraphs of their prospective op-ed. The pre-publication review process is supposed to protect classified information, nothing else. But in our case, the White House abused its power to politicize that process solely in order to silence two former officials who can speak in a uniquely informed way about the Bush administration's strategic blunders toward Iran. Neither my co-author, who's sitting beside me and is my husband, nor I would disclose any classified information, and I have not done so today, and I don't think he will either. But neither will we be intimidated by a White House acting in a fundamentally un-American way to silence criticism of its policies. It is in that spirit that I have come forward to testify before you today.
And I think it took some courage on your behalf to do that, and I appreciate it, and the committee appreciates it. I want to thank you for that. Our next witness is Dr. Flint Leverett, who served as Senior Director of Middle East Affairs at the National Security Council from March 2002 to March 2003. He's also served as the Middle East expert on the Secretary of State's policy planning staff and as a senior analyst at the Central Intelligence Agency, focusing on the Middle East for 9 years. Currently also publishes articles on the strategic implications of energy market trends, particularly in the Middle East, and studies the implications of structural shifts in global energy markets and develops analytical frameworks for thinking about energy as a foreign policy issue. Dr. Leverett would benefit from 5 minutes of your testimony as well.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Shays, for the chance to speak to the subcommittee today. As you were kind enough to allude in your introduction, I worked on Middle East issues in the U.S. government for 11 years, from 1992, the last year of the George H.W. Bush administration, until 2003, the year in which the United States, under the current Bush administration, invaded Iraq. During those 11 years, I watched U.S. standing and influence in the Middle East decline from the dominant, indeed hegemonic position that we enjoyed in the region after the first Gulf War to the, I would say, floundering and ineffective position that we occupy today. There are many reasons for the decline in America's standing and influence in what is arguably the world's most strategically critical region. Since walking out of the Bush White House in disgust in 2003, I have said and written publicly that I believe the Bush administration has made profound strategic blunders in its conduct of the war on terror, blunders for which we will continue to pay a price in the Middle East for many years to come. But I also believe that the Clinton administration, during its tenure, made profound strategic mistakes that contribute to our current, rather parlous strategic condition in the Middle East. And I would note for the record, I am not working for anyone's presidential campaign in this electoral cycle. While there are many factors that contribute to the decline of American standing and influence in the Middle East over the last 15 years, as I look at the record during that period, it seems to me that perhaps the single most important factor for our decline in this part of the world is a policy framework toward the Islamic Republic of Iran that is dysfunctional for U.S. interests on virtually all of the region's key security, political, and economic challenges. Getting Iran policy right will not fix everything that's wrong with America's position in the Middle East, but I would argue that if we don't get Iran policy right, there is going to be little or no strategic recovery for the United States in this strategically vital region. Over the last couple of years, I would say there has been a growing recognition that our current policy toward Iran is dysfunctional, that we need to step up engagement with Iran. A growing body of politicians, distinguished foreign policy experts, and eminent persons groups like the Iraq Study Group have all made this argument. In almost all these instances, recommendations for stepping up engagement with Iran take what I would call an incremental approach. In this approach, the United States would identify particular areas where American interests presumably overlap with those of Iran, such as post-conflict stabilization in Iraq, and would engage Tehran on those specific issues. If things went well and a certain level of the confidence were established, the range of issues under discussion could be gradually expanded. That kind of incremental approach seems prudent and relatively uncontroversial, except perhaps to those, I would call them strategically autistic opponents of any kind of engagement with Iran. But unfortunately, incrementalism is not going to work at this point to produce sustained improvement in U.S.-Iranian relations. Advocates of incrementalism ignore an almost 20-year history of issue-specific engagement between the United States and the Islamic Republic, as my wife and former NSC colleague Hilary Mann documents in her testimony. In each case where issue-specific engagement was tried, it has essentially been the United States which declined to sustain that cooperation or to use that cooperation to explore possibilities for a broad-based strategic opening with the Islamic Republic. Today, the United States is pursuing extremely tentative, issue-specific engagement with Iran over Iraq. The Bush administration has also indicated a highly conditional willingness to engage in multilateral talks with Tehran over Iranian nuclear activities. However, given the record of U.S.-Iranian tactical engagement since the late 1980s, at this point, Iran is not going to offer significant cooperation to the United States, whether with regard to Iraq or the nuclear issue or anything else, except as part of a broader rapprochement with the United States that addresses Tehran's core concerns. This would require the United States to be willing, as part of an overall settlement, to extend a security guarantee to the Islamic Republic of Iran, effectively an American commitment not to use force to change the borders or the form of government of the Islamic Republic, and to bolster such a contingent commitment with the prospect of lifting U.S. unilateral sanctions and normalizing bilateral relations. This is something no American administration has ever offered, and it is something that the Bush administration has explicitly refused to consider. I should note in this regard that some Iranian diplomats and academics say both publicly and privately that the Islamic Republic does not need security guarantees from the United States. However, when one asks those diplomats and academics what the Islamic Republic does require from the United States, they routinely talk about American acceptance of the Islamic Republic and recognition of a legitimate Iranian role in the region, and it is precisely American acceptance of the Islamic Republic and recognition of legitimate Iranian interests that is the core of what I mean by a security guarantee. From an American perspective, it has to be acknowledged that no administration of either party would be able to provide a security guarantee to the Islamic Republic unless U.S. concerns about Iran's nuclear activities, its regional role, and its support for terrorist organizations were definitively addressed. Addressing only one or some of these issues would not provide a politically sustainable basis for real rapprochement between the United States and Iran. That's why at this juncture, resolving any of the significant bilateral differences between the United States and the Islamic Republic inevitably requires resolving all of them. Incrementalism will not work. A comprehensive approach aimed at negotiating what I and others describe as a grand bargain between Washington and Tehran, in which all the major differences between the U.S. and Iran would be resolved in a package, is the only strategy that might produce meaningful results. Implementing the reciprocal commitments entailed in a U.S.-Iranian grand bargain would almost certainly not be implemented all at once, but the commitments would have to be all agreed up front as a package so that both sides would know what they were getting. Really what we need at this point is a reorientation of American policy toward the Islamic Republic of Iran that will be as fundamental and comprehensive as the reorientation of U.S. policy toward the People's Republic of China that took place in the early 1970s under President Nixon. Barring that, any kind of incremental diplomatic effort that is not cast on that kind of scale will fail, and U.S.-Iranian relations will continue in their current dysfunctional condition, and indeed on their current trajectory. I would suggest that without that kind of fundamental improvement, we are looking at an eventual military confrontation between the United States and the Islamic Republic of Iran. This is really a time when sound policy requires fundamental rethinking. It is really a case at this point of all or nothing. Either we're prepared to put everything on the table with Iran and negotiate, or else we are headed at some point in the near to medium term to some kind of military confrontation, and I believe that the biggest loser in that confrontation in terms of strategic standing in the Middle East would be the United States and not the Islamic Republic of Iran. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Doctor. We appreciate your testimony. Our next witness is Lawrence J. Haas, who's the Vice President of the Committee on Present Danger. He also served as a visiting senior fellow at Georgetown University's Government Affairs Institute. He was the White House communications strategist and an award-winning journalist. Has been a communications director and press secretary for Vice President Al Gore. Previously was a communications director for the White House Office of Management and Budget. Served for 2 years as Director of Public Affairs and Special Assistant to the President at Yale University, where he led Yale's communication efforts. And from 2001 to 2005, was Senior Vice President and Director of Public Affairs at Manning, Selvage & Lee, one of the world's largest public relations firms. Mr. Haas.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Shays, members of the subcommittee, thank you very much for the opportunity to appear before you today. I appreciate the fact that my full testimony, prepared testimony, will be inserted into the record, because I feel like I'm, in the 5 minutes allotted, I'm going to go over it far too superficially, but perhaps we can get into more depth during the question and answer period. As you will see, I have a different view of things. Part of it has to do with a different interpretation of some recent events, but really more of it has to do with a different focus that I want to take, so let me get to it. Mr. Chairman, I understand the desire to strike a grand bargain with Iran, as Flint just alluded to. I just don't think such a deal is there. Moreover, our efforts to strike one could hurt our national security, enabling Tehran to make more progress on its nuclear program while we negotiate, and driving away an Iranian population that hates the regime, supports democratic reform, and thinks favorably of America. We are in the 28th year of our crisis with Iran. Perhaps we all agree on that. During that time, the regime has not changed in any significant way. It is aggressive, expansionist, and rabidly anti-Western, and a growing threat to the security of the United States and its allies. And in fact, it is growing more extreme. President Ahmadinejad subscribes to a radical strain of Islamic ideology that predicts the return of the 12th Imam, the so-called Mahdi, a messianic figure from the 9th century who supposedly will reappear to signal the end of history and bring Islamic justice to the world. Ahmadinejad and others believe a violent confrontation with the West will be a harbinger of the Mahdi's return, and that Iran can speed that return by provoking that confrontation. This ideology, by the way, is shared by many hardliners in his cabinet, across the government, and, very importantly, in the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. I need not tell you what the implications of this were Iran ever to be able to develop nuclear weapons, of which I'll talk about in another moment or two. Now, advocates of a grand bargain, as we hear, often say, and I think I heard an allusion to this a few moments ago, often say we can apply the Cold War's containment policy against Iran. But containment assumed that the two sides at that time shared a desire for life over death. That analogy makes no sense with a regime that seeks a violent confrontation with the West to bring about the end of the world. The fact is Iran has been at war with the United States, which it calls the Great Satan, for 28 years. Rabid hostility is built into the DNA of the regime, serving almost as its raison d'etre. Iran's history of murder and mayhem against Americans directly or through its terrorist clients continues to this day, with Iran responsible for a growing share of American deaths in Iraq and Afghanistan, and there's more detail of that in my prepared testimony. Iran is planning much more. Chants of death to America pervade its parliament and speeches by its top officials. Ahmadinejad has spoken of a world without America that is, quote, attainable and surely can be achieved. I would just ask the members of this subcommittee to remember the words of Abba Eban, the former Israeli diplomat, who said, quote, it is our experience that political leaders do not always mean the opposite of what they say. Those who advocate a grand bargain should explain, with all due respect, why earlier efforts failed so miserably. Every White House, as we've heard, has sought to normalize relations with Tehran. But also, Great Britain, France, and Germany spent 3 years negotiating with Iran over its nuclear program, offering a host of economic incentives, and that's between 2003 and 2006. Iran is not interested in economic carrots or normalization, I would submit. Now we're in a race against time. Ahmadinejad has just announced, and I mean just within the last 24 hours announced, that Iran has 3,000 uranium enrichment centrifuges running at Natanz. The continuing running of those centrifuges for 1 year will produce enough enriched uranium for one nuclear bomb, which means that Tehran could have a bomb by next fall. Fortunately, the story need not end there, or with the choice between acquiescing in an Iran with nuclear weapons or military action to destroy or slow its program. We have other options. Iran's leaders are vulnerable economically in at least 3 ways. First, Iran has loads of oil, but it can't refine enough to fulfill its needs. It imports 40% of its annual gasoline consumption. We surely can squeeze the regime through tactics such as an embargo on gasoline imports. Second, Tehran requires $1 billion a year of foreign direct investment just to maintain the refining capacity it has. And we should make it harder, as we're trying to do, for Iran to find that investment. And third, economic power resides most prominently with the extended family of former President Rafsanjani, with the foundations run by the Supreme Leader, and with the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. Sanctions can restrict their ability to participate in the global marketplace, and of course we've gone somewhat down the road in that strategy as well. Iran's leaders, I also would like to point out, are vulnerable politically. 70% of Iranians, according to a poll, favor better relations with the West. 2/3 of Iranians are under the age of 35. They are restive and dissatisfied, and they can bring democratic change to Iran, and there is plenty of stirring of democratic activism in Iran under horrendous conditions. We must strengthen our ties to these young activists, this younger generation, as we pressure the regime. And by the way, a grand bargain with the regime, in the unlikely event that we could secure one, I would suggest to you would move us in exactly the wrong direction when it comes to this next generation. They would view it as a U.S. betrayal of their hopes for a democratic future. We must not forget the long-term consequences of our activities. So, we need a strategy that capitalizes on public disgust with Iran's regime, the vulnerability of its economy, and our potential partnership with the Iranian people. While tightening the economic noose on the regime, we should talk directly to the Iranian people through TV, radio, the Internet, and other means of communications. I want to emphasize that I am separating our treatment of the regime with our outreach to the Iranian people. And one final point. Many policymakers express alarm about tougher U.S.-led sanctions because they view them as a precursor to war with Iran, and we saw that with the recent round of unilateral sanctions announced by the Bush administration. I have a different view. Sanctions are not a precursor to war if done correctly. They are an alternative to war. If we want to avert military action, and I think we all do, we must give a comprehensive program of economic pressure on the one hand and public outreach to the Iranian people on the other hand a chance to work. Mr. Chairman, Mr. Ranking Member, members of the subcommittee, that concludes my testimony, and I look forward to the questions and answers at the appropriate time.
Thank you, Mr. Haas. Is Mr. Haas or Mr. Haas?
Haas.
Haas. Thank you very much. The ranking member gives his apologies. He had to leave to go on the floor and speak, but he will be back. So he apologizes to you for missing the final part of your remarks, and to Dr. Maloney as well. Dr. Maloney has served as a public policy planning staff member at the United States Department of State from 2005 to 2007. She also was project director on the Independent Task Force on U.S.-Iran Relations on the Council on Foreign Relations from 2003 to 2004, and Middle East advisor to ExxonMobil from 2001 to 2004. Dr. Maloney, can we please hear your testimony?
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, thanks very much for the opportunity to participate in this discussion today on what I think is a very important issue. I think this is a rare opportunity to have a serious and probing discussion on an issue that is too often the subject of a lot of tough talk, all heat and no light. So I'm glad to be here and glad to have the opportunity to talk to you today. Since 2005, the administration has sought to devise a comprehensive approach toward Iran to deal with multiple areas of U.S. concern. The U.S. strategy was intended to present Tehran with a stark choice between moderation and isolation, and until relatively recently, Washington enjoyed unprecedented success in persuading a wide coalition of allies and international actors to support its efforts. Iran, of course, greatly contributed to uniting the world against it, particularly since the election of Mahmoud Ahmadinejad in 2005. Despite achieving this unprecedented international consensus, the latest U.S. strategy on Iran has borne very little fruit. More than anything, the failure of the current U.S. approach to Iran to achieve its aims reflects how complex and intractable this problem is. It has frustrated American officials from both sides of the political aisle for nearly 30 years. But the failure is also a product of the disastrous diplomacy of the Bush administration toward Iran and toward the broader Middle East, informed by a set of mistaken assumptions. Understanding where we've miscalculated and, more importantly, why is important to ensuring that we avoid repeating or perpetuating flawed policies. Chief among the issues that has frustrated our strategy is its inherent inconsistency, particularly since 2005 and the beginning of this overture to negotiate with Iran over its nuclear program. The administration's efforts have been sabotaged by the impossibility of balancing this belated interest in diplomacy with a fundamental rejection of the Iranian regime's legitimacy. The bottom line is that no regime is likely to bargain away its ultimate deterrent capability so long as it perceives that the ultimate objective of those negotiations is its own eradication. In reviewing some of the missed opportunities that my colleagues here have discussed, I think it's important that we avoid constructing a narrative that places responsibility solely on Washington or even this administration for the perpetuation of the estrangement between the two countries. Engagement can be a powerful tool for dealing with Iran, but there is really no evidence at this time that Iranian leaders have ever been prepared fully and authoritatively to make epic concessions on key areas of U.S. concern. It's also important that we not perpetuate the idea that U.S. policy bears responsibility for the rise of Ahmadinejad and the other unfortunate trends that we've seen within Iran domestically over the past few years. We couldn't have saved the reform movement from itself. Really, Iranian hardliners are responsible for its ejection from the front lines of Iranian policy. And ultimately, American policy can't transform political dynamics within Iran today. But with the wisdom of hindsight, it's very clear that the Bush administration's miscalculations that have been based on a misreading of Iran's internal dynamics have forfeited perhaps the best opportunity in history to generate real momentum for at least beginning to solve some of the deep differences and the problems that we have with Iranian policy and actions. These miscalculations continue today. The key, as I said before, is this idea that the regime is either on the verge of crumbling or that we, through our efforts, our diplomacy, our programming, have some capacity to take it down. It's an understandable presumption, and I'm happy to get into some of the reasons why I believe it not to be the case, but I think we've certainly seen it borne out. Every time we expect the next revolution is imminent, we find ourselves disappointed yet again here in Washington. This idea that the regime was on its last legs, I think, has informed a number of the episodes that have been discussed today, specifically the administration's decision in May 2003 to suspend its dialogue with Iran over Afghanistan that, as I understand it, had begun to deal with issues involving Iraq as well. It also informed the decision not to pursue the faxed offer of a grand bargain that appeared to be an overture from mid-ranking Iranian officials that came somewhere around the same time in 2003. I'd also suggest that this belief in regime change informed the administration's decision slowly but very dramatically in the past 2 years to embrace a very high-profile program for democracy support in Iran that has proven to be very ineffective and, in fact, has been resented by many of the Iranian advocates who it is intended to support. I would focus, I will not spend an inordinate amount of time on the specific historical episodes. My colleagues on this panel were there and participated in them, and I think have already spoken in depth about those episodes. But I would highlight this Geneva track, or the dialogue on Afghanistan, as potentially the most important miscalculation that the Bush administration committed. These talks were really unprecedented and important on two distinct levels. This was the first sustained, officially sanctioned dialogue between American and Iranian officials since the revolution. And secondly, as my colleagues have suggested, they really did produce some concrete results. This path, it seems to me, might have offered the best prospect for moving forward toward a less contentious relationship between Washington and Tehran and dealing with many of the key issues of our concern. It's tempting to talk mainly about the past here, but I'd like to spend a few moments focused on the path forward, because ultimately that's really the challenge before us today. And while I don't have a fully comprehensive offer, and I tend to be a skeptic on the issue of the possibility of pursuing a grand bargain, I'd like to lay out a couple of principles that I think can usefully inform a future policy toward Iran that may bring us more benefits than what we've seen from the Bush administration's approach to date. First, I think we have to start with the acknowledgement that diplomacy is our only effective tool. We simply do not have viable military options toward Tehran, either in dealing with its nuclear program or eliminating this regime. Anything that we might attempt would certainly do more to undermine our interests across the Middle East than it would to advance them. Starting with that, I think it's important to reaffirm the importance of engagement as an appropriate and effective tool for addressing our differences with Tehran. Many of those who favored engagement have become a little less vocal in recent years. It was a lot easier to talk about engaging with Tehran when the people that you were talking about talking to were potentially more palatable individuals than a man who denies the Holocaust and threatens to wipe the state of Israel off the map. And yet I think the best argument for engagement was never constituted one that focused on who we might be talking to, but really one that focuses on the seriousness of the issues at stake between us. The aim of diplomacy is to advance interests, not to make friends or endorse enemies. Engagement with Tehran is not an automatic path to rapprochement, nor should it involve a unilateral offer of a grand bargain. But it would simply return to the long-held position that really was axiomatic in American policy until 2003, that the U.S. is prepared to talk with Iranian leaders in a serious and sustained way in any authoritative dialogue as a means of addressing the profound issues of concern that we have with Iranian policy. Let me also just speak third to another principle that I think is important that we appreciate when we look toward formulating an effective policy toward Tehran, and this is that modest steps are unlikely to bring about revolutionary changes in Iranian policy. I say this because everywhere I go these days there's a lot of interest in the financial measures that the administration has taken, particularly the banking restrictions that have begun to constrict Iranian access to the international financial system as a whole. We know these measures have had some bite, and they've caused great inconvenience to Tehran and raised the cost of doing business. And they can potentially begin to change the strategic calculus. They will not produce a U-turn, and certainly will not do so in the near or medium term, simply because Iran, so long as it continues to export oil, will bring in approximately $70 billion a year in revenues, and that is enough to cushion this regime for the foreseeable future. So while I think it's important to look toward what incremental steps we can take to pressure the regime, we should be careful not to put our eggs in a basket that is unlikely to produce the result we're looking for. Fourth principle is simply that we need a broad coalition for dealing with Tehran, and this gets back to many of the other steps that some of my fellow panelists here have proposed. There's often a debate about whether sanctions that are applied narrowly but that are stiffer are more valuable than those that are applied broadly but might be a sort of a lesser common denominator value. I would suggest that Iranians are very averse to being isolated, and they feel the nature of their isolation very keenly. At this stage, those sanctions that involve only the departure of European companies, even Europeans, the Japanese and others, only create new opportunities for actors from particularly China and Russia to fill that gap. And so I would suggest that measures that sustain the international coalition rather than those like the designation of the Revolutionary Guard Corps that are likely to create new frictions with our allies in China and Moscow on this issue are the ones that we ought to be pursuing. Finally, and here I set myself apart from my neighbor here, I would argue that containment is a viable alternative strategy. Of course, it is second best. But no careful study of Iranian foreign policy would suggest that Iran is somehow a suicidal state. And containment promises the considerable virtue of being an achievable aim of U.S. policy. We have, in fact, contained Iran over the past 28 years, except insofar as we have created opportunities, particularly in Iraq, for Iran to expand its influence, simply because it was very well predisposed and prepositioned to do so. I think the prospective choice for the international community, as articulated recently by French President Nicolas Sarkozy, between an Iranian bomb and bombing Iran is a false one. That kind of rhetoric only obscures the dimensions of this critical dilemma and narrows our options unnecessarily. The real challenge for Washington is devising a strategy that maximizes our leverage for negotiating with Tehran while restoring confidence in our capacity and that of our allies to manage the Iranian regional challenge. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I want to thank all of you for testimony that I think really crystallizes the history, but also what we're looking at here and what the choices are. I'm going to start the questioning. I have 3 areas that I'm probably not going to get to finish in my short time, but hopefully we'll get another run at this. I want to talk about a little of the history of the lost opportunity because I think there's some issues I want to flesh out. I want to talk about going forward, the use of sanctions, and whether or not we ought to focus so intently on Mr. Ahmadinejad as opposed to Iranian people who might be in that position from time to time. And then I want to talk a little bit, Ms. Leverett, about the White House politicization of some of the things that are on that op-ed. I think that's important for us to get into. Let me start, Ms. Leverett, by asking you on page 6 of your testimony, you give a little bit of history, page 5 to 6, which I thought was fascinating, of all the opportunities that you experienced in your own life of ways that we might have reached out or accepted a hand that was reached out to us on that. But on page 6, the one that I think strikes us today, given what's going on in Pakistan as it impacts Afghanistan, you say that in December 2001, Tehran agreed to keep Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, the brutal pro-Taliban warlord, from returning to Afghanistan to lead jihadist resistance, so long as the Bush administration did not criticize it for harboring terrorists. But in his January 2002 State of the Union address, President Bush did just that in labeling Iran part of the axis of evil. Unsurprisingly, Hekmatyar managed to leave Iran in short order after the speech. I just make note that Mr. Hekmatyar is now giving us conniption fits in what he's doing in Afghanistan, and a very serious player in Pakistan and Afghanistan right now. Can you expand on those list of things that were, you think, opportunities and the importance that they play? Tell us, I don't think you fleshed out or had the opportunity or time to tell us some of the other things that were possible with the Iranians, given a list of individuals who were associated with al-Qaeda and so on.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. That was an important moment. Gulbuddin Hekmatyar is and was a vicious, brutal warlord, anti-American, but also anti-Taliban. And because he had been anti-Taliban, he had been allowed to have refuge in Iran, but the Iranians were never comfortable with his presence there, and did assure us that they would prevent him from going back to Afghanistan as long as we didn't accuse Iran of harboring terrorists, because he certainly would be considered one. That was a serious miscalculation on our part, in my view. The Iranians not only seemed interested and willing to cooperate and coordinate with us, with the likes of Hekmatyar, but other people that were seeking to come into Iran. The border between Iran and Afghanistan, or the triangular area between Iran, Afghanistan, and Pakistan is porous. It's infested with criminal gangs, drug traffickers, all sorts of terrorists and spies from the various countries. It's a pretty lawless area, and Iran frequently told us that it was difficult for them to patrol that area, but that in the interest of working with us and in support of the United States after the 9/11 attacks, that they would do what they could to patrol that border. And in February of 2002, the then Deputy Foreign Minister of Iran presented the UN Secretary General with copies of 200 passports of suspected al-Qaeda suspects that had come into Iran that Iran had picked up and had deported, and Iran was interested in talking to whoever would talk to them about others that had come into Iran, but that Iran did not have a relationship with the country of origin for some of those terrorists. Let me give you an example, kind of more of a theoretical example here, that Iran and Egypt don't have diplomatic relations, and they don't have intelligence cooperation or any kind of contacts in that regard, and certainly didn't then. Many of these, or some of these, people could have been from Egypt, and Iran did not have a way to deport them to Egypt. But they did deport others. The Saudi Foreign Minister and Interior Minister came out in June of 2002 and publicly said that Iran had deported suspected Al-Qaeda suspects of Saudi origin to Saudi Arabia. So there is also public documentation of this.
Thank you. Ambassador, on page 5 of your testimony that you didn't have a chance to speak to orally, you tell, I think, of an interesting meeting. You had a conversation with Secretary Powell about your experiences and the overtures made through you. Secretary Powell suggested you bring that to then Security Council National Security Advisor Rice, who then held a meeting with you, Secretary Powell, National Security Advisor Rice, and Secretary Rumsfeld. Would you go into that a little bit in detail? I'm not sure if it is on. It just needs to be brought up.
I was asked to recount my conversations with the Iranians, which I did very much along the lines that I've recounted them here. Their offer to participate in an American-led program to train and equip the new Afghan army under, clearly under an overall American umbrella. After a few minutes of silence at the end of my presentation, nobody took up the issue, and as far as I know, the Iranians never received a response. Go ahead. No, go ahead.
I just wanted to come back again to the issue of Al-Qaeda, because I think in particular Dr. Maloney has testified that she thinks that the continuation of the dialogue over Afghanistan to expand into other areas would have been useful. The Al-Qaeda issue is critical in that regard. The Iranians did do a lot on the Al-Qaeda issue. They did deport, or they presented evidence of deporting 200 Al-Qaeda operatives, and we then had the public confirmation from other countries like the Saudis. But we did claim that there were a handful of Al-Qaeda operatives that were still in Iran, and we made that a test of the dialogue for it to continue and for it to move into cooperation and coordination on Iraq. Whether or not the Iranians could or didn't want to meet that test is an open question. First, they said that they couldn't meet that test because, as I laid out, this area was not only porous, criminals, drug traffickers, anti-Iranian government elements in this area, that they said that it was hard for them to track down really a lot of people in that area, and they needed help from us. They needed more information from us. Any information from us that was not forthcoming from our side. We took it as a test. If they were really serious, they would send in whoever they needed to send in to ferret out those guys and hand it over. My view was that we should have, and we could have, provided some information to them, or as whatever they needed to make them successful in fighting Al-Qaeda. But instead we decided to turn it into a test. And that's the problem with pursuing this kind of tactical cooperation on very narrow issues, that you can get bogged down, as every instance has since the Reagan administration. Every one of these presidents has tried an opening, has tried tactical cooperation, and has gotten bogged down on an important issue. Here the dialogue was at an impasse. We could not get past the issue of whether or not Iran was just unwilling or unable to hand over the remaining Al-Qaeda operatives.
Thank you very much. Mr. Platt.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I thank all the witnesses for being here and participating in this important hearing, and thank the Chairman for continuing the process of reviewing our nation's best approach with Iran. I want to start a question that we talked about in our hearing last week regarding the designation of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard as a terrorist group and the Senate vote. And I'd be specific first, as I think I'm correct in saying, Dr. Leverett and Ms. Mann-Leverett, that you both believe that would be is an error for us to do so. Is that correct?
I certainly think it's counterproductive as a matter of policy. It is not going to accomplish anything constructive for U.S. interests. I think it will make it harder down the road to engage Iran seriously. The Revolutionary Guard is roughly 130,000 people. If you count their families, you're probably easily talking more than 500,000 people. It is, in many ways, fairly broadly representative of Iranian society. Singling them out for this kind of treatment is not going to make it easier for the U.S. to engage Iran.
But I guess, so it's not that you don't think they are a terrorist group to meet the definition, but how it impacts our broader negotiations with Iran. Is that accurate?
That's right. I think in too many instances, we impose unilateral sanctions on Iran, not because it's actually going to help us achieve some policy objective, but because it makes us feel good to do that. There's no evidence that these kinds of unilateral designations will do anything to advance our policy agenda toward Iran.
So does that apply then to other terrorist organizations around the world or other nations that are sponsoring terrorism, that it's meaningless and actually hurts our interest to properly designate an entity that is engaged in supporting terrorism?
Well, let me say, I think it's analogous to, in some ways, to the decision to disband the Iraqi military after the overthrow of Saddam Hussein. In this situation, you are talking about at least 125,000 armed, trained, well-funded people in Iran and their extended families who are dependent on these Rev Guard members for their entire livelihood. We want something from them. They're not like Al-Qaeda that we don't want something from. We want something from the Rev Guard. We want them to deliver in Iraq so that our soldiers are protected and so that we can succeed in Iraq. We want them to deliver on the nuclear issue, to be able to come clean and at least have that program fully monitored, if not disbanded. We want them to deliver in terms of their support or their connections to Hamas and the Islamic Jihad. We actually want something from them. So it's analogous to disbanding the Iraqi military under Saddam Hussein. I wouldn't have said, I don't think many people would have said, that these are nice people or good people, but we needed that military force in Iraq after 2003, just like we're going to need to work with the Revolutionary Guard if there's going to be any kind of resolution to our disputes with Iran.
But there's certainly, I'm trying to get what approach we should take of when we should designate an entity, a terrorist group, when we shouldn't, and there are others that we want something from in the sense of changing their actions to improve peace in a region or directly with us, that are either sponsoring terrorism or, again, terrorist organizations themselves. And it seems that we should not designate anyone a terrorist group or a terrorist sponsoring nation, because that may make us feel good, in your words, but it's not going to help us achieve a broader good.
Look, there may be practical reasons to designate non-state organizations as terrorist organizations in order to help with various kinds of enforcement efforts against them. I would say in terms of the state-sponsor designation, I can't think of a single instance in which designating a state as a state sponsor of terrorism has actually helped to get that state out of the terrorism business, except possibly in the case of Libya, where we were prepared to put it on the table that if you were willing to get yourself out of the terrorism business, this designation could be removed. We've never made that kind of offer to the Islamic Republic of Iran. We've never made it to Syria. And it's hard to see what that designation is actually accomplishing in terms of advancing American interests. In the case of the Rev Guard designation, I would suggest this is the first time that we've designated part of a sovereign government not just as a sponsor of terrorism, but actually as a designated global terrorist. And if you believe that's going to advance our agenda, that's fine.
And I don't mean to cut you off because we're given 5 minutes. And Mr. Chairman, can Mr. Haas respond to that same question before? Yeah, if that's okay. Yep. Thank you.
You know, we have been through the State Department designating state sponsors of terrorism for quite some number of years. And I think there's a certain value in clarity. I think it's important that the State Department tells the American people who is doing what around the world. It is the case that the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps is an arm of the Iranian government. It is, at this very moment, supplying the weaponry that is killing our soldiers in Iraq, to the extent that we have an ability through designation and then follow-up steps to put pressure on the IRGC and try to convince them to move in a different direction. I think that's something that we should try. I think the problem, frankly, with a lot of what we've tried to do is that we have had, as I think Ms. Maloney said before, a kind of disjointed effort where we have been only partially serious. When we have tried to do something, we have moved through pressure to diplomacy to pressure to diplomacy. But I must say, I am, number one, not morally offended by the idea of designating states or groups that do things and clarify what it is they do. And I am not terribly sympathetic with the idea that this corps of 125,000 people who is right now engaged in killing American soldiers should somehow take a backseat to the fact that if we designate them, they won't be able to feed their families.
I do want to get Ambassador.
I don't think that was exactly responsive to what anybody said about feeding their families or whatever, but that's just one person's impression on that.
Well, it was, Mr. Chairman, it was repeated by both witnesses who answered that was part of the reason we shouldn't is impact on the families that provide their total livelihood.
The issue is what will work and won't work. What won't.
I'm sorry, Dr. Leverett, what?
The issue was not one of feeding families. The issue is what is the impact of this designation going to be inside Iran, and is this going to increase the chances that we will be able to advance our policy agenda, or will it in fact decrease the chances that we can advance our policy agenda? It's not about whether this is morally justified or not. The issue is what is going to work for American interests.
Ambassador.
If the Revolutionary Guard were a rogue force that you wanted to single out because they were...
Microphone on, sir. I'm sorry.
Sorry?
Is your microphone on?
Yeah.
Oh, thank you.
Sorry. If it was a rogue force that was acting independently, then there would be a logic to singling them out, because otherwise they wouldn't be covered. We've already singled out Iran. The Revolutionary Guard is acting not as a rogue force, but as an instrument of Iran. So the issue
not
is
according to the government of Iran. They're not acknowledging that they're part of their government in the terrorist supporting activities.
Well, but they're also arguing that they're not doing it. So I mean, I think that Iran is not trying to disassociate itself from the Revolutionary Guard. They may be trying to disassociate the Revolutionary Guard from terrorism. So the issue of whether you need to go beyond designating Iran and also designate a subordinate element of Iran really is a pragmatic, is one of pragmatism. You've solved your moral problem. You've designated the terrorist. It's the state of Iran. Do you want to go beyond that and sanction a particular component of that government in an effort to affect its policy? And so it's a question of, do you think that you're going to get less terrorism or more terrorism as a result of this? And everybody can make their own judgment. As another witness has noted, we're at the end of 28 years of a policy of sanctions and no or little communication. And that particular policy mix hasn't been working very well.
Mr. Young,
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks to all the witnesses. I mentioned the story in Esquire that featured the two of you last week, so I'm very pleased that you're here today. Something's been troubling me ever since reading the story in Esquire, and I hope somebody can explain this to me. If we're engaged in back-channel communications with a company that we are publicly saying we're not talking to, what is the purpose of saying publicly that we're not talking to them if they know that we're actually behind the scenes talking to them? Who is that aimed at?
In some cases, it can be designed to protect the government. In other words, there have been occasions in which the Iranians wanted to talk to us, but weren't prepared to admit that they were talking to us because of their own domestic opinion. And so there have been occasions in which this has been kept quiet in deference to their public opinion rather than ours. I suspect mostly it has been mutual, though. That is, communication has been controversial in both societies, and therefore both governments had some interest in keeping it out of the newspapers.
Okay, and I guess I would follow up, Ms. Leverett, if you're going to answer this. In this particular case, what would have been our government's purpose in doing that?
First of all, not all the communication was back channel. The cooperation and the coordination on Afghanistan, particularly in the 6+2 process, was open, was public, was constructive. The ministers met. Secretary Powell met with Foreign Minister Kharzi as part of the 6+2 in November. I think it was November 10th, 2001. We were in the basement, in a meeting room in the basement of the United Nations when one of an American airliner actually crashed in Queens, and there was a lockdown at the UN. The Pakistani minister was late; he didn't get there. The building was locked down. We were there with Foreign Minister Karzai, Secretary Powell, Secretary General Annan, Brahimi was there as special representative. Jim Dobbins was there. Others were there, and Kharzi, the foreign minister of Iran at the time, had his prepared remarks, but then he hand wrote into his prepared remarks that he was horrified by what could be yet another attack on the United States, and that Iran stood with the American people against this kind of terrorism. And one of his aides brought it to me, and I had it passed to Powell. So people saw that. These were things that were open and public. The meetings that we would have with the Iranians in Paris and Geneva were not secret. They weren't advertised, but they weren't secret. And then in terms of why that would be the case, I think that Jim is absolutely correct that there are a lot of hesitations and divisions on the Iranian side. But I think even more importantly, they're because of divisions and consternation that would be caused here in the United States. First and foremost, from what I experienced, were divisions within the administration. I think that people at the State Department were much more willing and interested in having clear, transparent talks with the Iranians, but people at the Pentagon and in the Vice President's office were absolutely against it. They thought that even the idea of talks, whether they be back channel or public, would be some sort of reward for the Islamic Republic and would put an imprimatur on the Islamic Republic that it was somehow legitimate, that the United States would legitimate this republic for another generation, and then that itself was not moral. And I was in the room when the president said that as well, that the U.S. could put that kind of imprimatur on the Islamic Republic and legitimate it, and that was not something he was prepared to do publicly. But then even a little bit more broadly, I think the biggest thing was within the administration, the deep, deep divisions within the administration. But then I think this administration probably, like other administrations that I document in my testimony, this isn't the first time. The Clinton administration had talks also with the Iranians over arming the Bosnian Muslims to prevent ethnic cleansing there. Similarly, those talks were cut off when the presumptive candidate Dole in 1996 learned of them and was going to embarrass the administration. We've had this happen. Iran-Contra is a famous example of that. Immediately, whenever there's any idea that it could be, the American public could know that the U.S. may want to engage Iran, the U.S. cuts those talks off. There's, I think, an idea that within the U.S. body politic, they would not be sustainable. And so for very political, in my view, crass reasons, every administration, Reagan, Clinton, George H.W., and this George W. Bush have cut off talks with Iran that could have been productive because of both political reasons here and because there's no broader strategic context to have the talks. I think for most people to be having talks with Iran or with any group that has acted against U.S. interests, if you're having those talks and then there's a bombing, like there was on May 12, 2003 in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, and that could somehow be connected to Iran, and we're sitting with them at a table, that is seen as unsavory. And the idea, you need to have, I think as Flint has laid out, the grand bargain in order to have these kind of narrow tactical talks. It's very difficult to be sitting and talking with the Iranians or whoever else it is when there are bombings going off at other places and people could be, rightly or wrongly, accusing the Iranians of being behind those bombings. We need to have the strategic context where we're also talking about terrorism, where we're also talking about the nuclear issue, other issues, so that in each one of these narrow dialogues they're protected from the next suicide bomber who's going to literally drive a truck, through those talks.
Thank you, Ms. Levitt. Mr. Hodes, you're recognized for 5 minutes. Mr. Hodes has disappeared. He's not recognized at all. Mr. Lynch, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank you and the ranking member for putting this together. I want to thank our witnesses for helping the committee out with this problem. We talked about I know a number of you mentioned that the opportunity to use sanctions might be an alternative to something more serious. And I wanted to talk about that. There are some remarks in today's testimony that suggest that the Oil for Food program, which was a limited sanction, was a workable model. But to be honest with you, from my standpoint, I know that Saddam ended up with about $8 billion that he shouldn't have had under that sanction. And looking at Iran, looking at the fact that I think there are 1,700 German companies in there doing business right now. Italy is its third largest trading partner. India's got interests there. There are a whole lot of folks that rely heavily on Iranian oil and have other relationships there. The effectiveness of any sanction program will depend on the willingness of our international partners to help us to implement that. And I just have great doubt the effectiveness of a sanction program, and I've noted it in several versions of the testimony here today, so I just want to throw that out there and tell me I'm wrong and tell me how we can actually put in an effective program of sanctions that might help bring them to the table.
Yeah, Mr. Lynch, I think your skepticism is very well founded. As I suggested earlier, I don't think U.S. unilateral sanctions have accomplished anything of strategic significance with regard to Iran, and that would include the more recent rounds of unilateral financial sanctions that have been imposed. And I think, frankly, the multilateral sanctions that have been imposed through the Security Council so far have also not had any kind of strategic impact on Iranian decision-making. And I think you're exactly right. The chances of our managing to muster enough international support for multilateral sanctions, which might, in theory, put that kind of pressure on the Iranian regime, frankly, I think the 12th Mahdi is more likely to return than for us to get that kind of support for multilateral measures. We have to face the reality that there have been some very, very important changes, structural shifts in global energy markets. Iran has the second largest proven reserves of conventional crude oil in the world. It has the second largest proven reserves of natural gas in the world. U.S. policy at this point is that oil and gas should stay in the ground until we, for reasons that will have nothing to do with the global energy balance, decide it's okay to bring it out. In this day and age, that position is simply not sustainable, and it means that if we think either unilateral or multilateral sanctions will solve this problem for us, we're dreaming.
Could I add a little bit about that, Mr. Lynch? I think the record of sanctions is a little better than Flint or you have suggested. First of all, the sanctions on Iraq were remarkably effective, probably the most stringent and effective sanctions regime in history, as the administration's own reports done after the invasion have demonstrated. They meant that the Iraqi regime could not reconstitute its WMD programs. They meant that its conventional military became weaker every year, over year. $8 billion in diverted assets is certainly a problem. but Iraq exports about $60 billion a year worth of oil, and you had 10 years worth of sanctions. That's $600 billion, of which he got $8 million, and he didn't get $592 billion. With oil at $100 a barrel, Iran is going to have a significant degree of latitude. But it's compared to what? In the absence of sanctions, Iran could be enjoying a much higher level of prosperity.
Ambassador, you've made a fair point, and I just don't want you to gobble up all my time. I have one other question, if I may, and that is this. Well, there's important differences. We went through Iraq, pretty thoroughly during the Gulf War. We haven't been through Iran, so I don't think sanctions would work effectively in Iran. Let me just ask you this. In terms of a number of you said about the delicacy of negotiating or even opening a dialogue with Iran or moderate elements within Iran. It is a sensitive issue. We've been approached, members of this committee have been approached by members of the Bundestag and some other groups that say, let's start dialogue at some level. From your own experience, how the heck does that happen? How do we have a quarantine sort of, I don't want to talk
Excuse me, which one of the panels would you like to answer that, because we really
well, actually,
to answer it.
Ambassador Dobbins and actually Ms. Leverett actually addressed this point in her remarks. So why don't I ask her? How does that happen if we're trying to be brought into this dialogue? How does that happen?
Basically, an interparliamentarian dialogue, essentially, between the House and Senate, House or Senate members and Iranian parliamentarians. That's the question. Senator Biden actually proposed that in, I think it was the spring of 2002, and brought it to the White House to see whether he could get some support for it or permission for it or something like that. There was the kind of, by this point, probably well-known ideological opposition in some quarters to that kind of dialogue. And then there was just the kind of logistical idea, how could this work? How could it work with visas? How could it work with kind of herding cats, in a sense, was the idea on both sides. Between 2002 and 2004, I thought it was an incredibly important idea, and I advocated for it within the White House. At that time, actually starting in the year 2000, the Iranian parliament, I think, between 2000 and 2004, had the freest, most contested elections that it's had in some time. The parliament had a significant number of reformists in it. Particularly the committee that dealt with foreign affairs and national security issues was a very robust, vigorous committee. Let me give you an example. If you recall, in January 2002, right before the President's State of the Union, where he designated Iran as part of the axis of evil, there was an incident called the Korean A shipment, of probably about 50 tons of weapons that were said to have shipped from Iran going towards Gaza and headed towards Yasser Arafat. It was a little bit strange because the Iranians had never supported Yasser Arafat. They've always supported Hamas or PIJ or other Islamist organizations, not Arafat himself. But still, this was out there, and the President and Secretary of Defense were making public statements about how terrible it was that Iran would be trying to get this type of weaponry to Arafat. Well, this committee in the Iranian parliament looked into this, and they chose to investigate. And there were press items at the time coming out of Iran that the committee they had hearings, they questioned people, and one of their findings was that the ports on the coast of Iran weren't all that well managed, weren't all that well regulated, and perhaps the ship could have left from Iranian waters, even though the Iranian government said that it did. The Iranian government actually denied that it authorized the shipment. Now, dealing with Iran, this is a really important issue. If you have the government of Iran officials saying we didn't authorize it, it doesn't mean it didn't happen. And we have the same situation today with Iraq, whether they're authorizing IEDs to go into Iraq or not. These weapons are getting there. So this is an important issue. The parliament and parliamentarians looked into it, and they made their recommendations of perhaps how they could deal with it. It would have been very useful for members of this committee and others to be able to meet with those Iranians and give them the support they needed to take those ideas further. Unfortunately, the new parliament in Iran is not nearly as forward-leaning, but I would still say that, as you all know from being elected, you have constituents at home. I would say that most Iranians probably do not want their country to be attacked. They do not want to have a bad relationship with the United States, and it would be something worth pursuing. It's a difficult environment, but I would pursue it if you can.
Thank you, Ms. Levitt. Mr. Shays,
Mr. Chairman, I yield
5 minutes.
back.
That's a good sense of humor.
Mr. Shays, about 1 minute left. Mr. Lynch, use the rest.
I thank you all for being here. I was on the floor because of a debate on the Employment Non-Discrimination Act. This is a hugely important issue. I sense that we have 4 people who see it one way and 1 person who sees it a different way, who happen to work with Vice President Gore, which makes it all the more interesting. I want to say first, it is a stunning thing that a country would take and seize diplomats and hold them for 444 days. And that is a stain on Iran that is palpable. Even in times of war, you exchange your diplomats. And it is palpable to me that Iran basically funds Hamas, or trains Hamas, funds Hezbollah, and has been incredibly active in Iraq, killing American soldiers. So I believe in dialogue, but I don't want to look like fools in the process. And I don't want to have a view that says, the more you attack us and the more you hurt us, the more we want to talk to you. It seems like a strange incentive. But at the same time, I happen to think there should be embassies at every country. There should have been in Iraq. We should have one in in Cuba. We should have one in North Korea, and we should have one in Iran. I believe that very strongly. What I would like to know is, I would like a simple answer from each of you. Do you believe, and I'll start with you, Ambassador, that Iran is seeking to develop nuclear weapons?
I believe Iran is seeking to develop the capability
for nuclear weapons. Okay,
to develop
I'll accept that.
Nuclear weapons, whether
Levitt?
they've made a decision to go beyond.
Well, the point is, once they've done the capability, they could do it in months if they had the capability.
They would be at the position.
So your answer is, you believe they want to develop the capability for nuclear weapons. I just want to know. I want to know where you're coming from. Ms. Levitt?
I would agree. I would agree with Jim Dobbins. I do think they are trying to have a breakout capability. I would point.
Excuse me. I only have a few minutes,
Sure.
and you've had plenty of time to talk. Dr. Levitt?
I'd agree with Jim Dobbins and my wife.
Thank you. Mr. Haas?
Well, I absolutely agree, and you may have been out of the room before when I mentioned this, but Ahmadinejad just announced that he's got 3,000 centrifuges fully working in Natanz, and if those are working and running...
See, I don't really believe him. I believe he...
Well, that's fine, but the IAEA also estimated that he would have about 3,000 around this time of year.
But the bottom line is, you believe he is wanting the capability for nuclear weapons, right?
Not just him. I think the upper echelon of the government in Tehran shares that hope.
Dr. Maloney?
Yes, I'd agree with all of my fellow panelists that Iran is seeking capability for nuclear weapons. Whether they've made the decision to weaponize at this stage, I think, remains an open question.
Let me start with you. Do you believe that Iran is providing IEDs to militia and al-Qaeda in Iraq?
I believe that Iran is supporting Shia and other militias in Iraq with
And
munitions
providing
as well
IEDs?
as financial support.
And not IEDs?
Munitions as well as financial support,
Okay.
yes.
Mr. Haas?
All sorts of weaponry and funds as well, I agree.
Dr. Levitt?
Iran has been supporting Shia militia groups in Iraq for more than 20 years. I'm not surprised they're continuing to do it.
So is the answer yes?
Whether or not it's specifically IEDs, I've seen no public evidence of that.
You've seen no evidence that the weapons that we have taken apart are not connected? You need to be, it seems to me, as candid with me as you are about things you want to be candid about. You do not believe that Iran has provided IEDs to various elements within Iraq? You don't believe that?
I said that Iran has clearly provided munitions and other kinds of support to Shia militia groups Whether that extends specifically to IEDs,
So you don't know if they provided IEDs?
I've not seen
Do you
what I
believe they
consider
have?
persuasive.
Do you believe they have or not?
It is entirely possible.
Do you believe they have or not? I want to know
don't.
what you believe. You either believe they have or you believe they haven't. Which is it?
I'm saying I don't know whether they provided IEDs specifically.
Okay. What do you think, Ms. Levitt?
I also don't know. I know the history of the 20-year support, so I wouldn't be surprised, but I don't know.
What do you think, Ambassador?
I think they have. I think it's a small minority of the IEDs we've encountered, but there's some of the more sophisticated ones.
Let me explain to you why it wouldn't be the small. There are two types, basically. There's just the munitions that they grab up and explode, and then there are munitions that they can, IEDs that they can direct, and they are extraordinarily sophisticated, and they are made by the Iranians. And there is no question on the mind of anyone I've spoken with who cares to know it that they have provided it. And
I'm not arguing that.
And it is not an argument that we shouldn't have dialogue.
Right.
But it is surprising to me, both Mr. and Ms. Levitt, that you do not have a sense of what they've done, and yet you are real experts on Iran. I would think you would care to know. I would think you would seek out to know, and it is surprising to me that you don't know. Now, let me ask you another question. What is your basic point is that with you, Ms. Levitt, that under the Bush administration we missed opportunities, and you said, well, other administrations have as well. Tell me an opportunity the Reagan administration missed. Tell me an opportunity the Bush administration first. Tell me an opportunity the first Clinton administration missed.
So I wouldn't necessarily characterize them as opportunities missed. I think that each administration did look for and participate in an opening, trying to have an opening with Iran. Of course, during the Reagan administration, it's well known what came to pass in the Iran-Contra scandal. There, of course, were openings, there were talks, there was a visit to Tehran, and there was the sale of missiles to Tehran in order to divert those proceeds to the Contras in contravention of Congress. That was during the Reagan administration. During the first Bush administration, George H.W. Bush, there were contacts in order to get U.S. hostages released from Lebanon, and there was a pledge by President Bush at the time that goodwill would beget goodwill. And one of the Iranians that I was charged with talking with as part of the dialogue under this Bush administration had a very strong memory of that and had felt that Iran had done what was asked of it and did not receive any reciprocal moves in return from the first Bush administration. During the Clinton administration, another one of my interlocutors that I was charged with meeting during this Bush administration was a high-ranking Iranian official serving in the Balkans, and he said that he had talks with his American counterpart in Bosnia, and that there was an agreement for Iran to be able to get weapons to the Bosnian Muslims to avert further ethnic cleansing. He said that he thought it was worthwhile to have talked to the Americans and to have gotten those weapons to the Bosnian Muslims, but that their talks, that effort was cut off precipitously in 1996, and he took a lesson from that it was hard to deal with the U.S. That was the Clinton administration. Then under this administration,
well, I think you were clear, and I'm not disagreeing with your points. And I wrote down crazy. I think you saw opportunities that this administration could have seized. I've seen the same thing with Syria, and dialogues that I've had with Syria. It has been a bipartisan kind of craziness, in my judgment, that I think you are very legitimate in sharing with us. The challenge I have is that as we keep waiting to have dialogue and things get worse, it almost is a perverse incentive. You know, the more you do, the more terrible things you do to us, the more we should be paying attention to you, and so we're going to start to. And what I sensed with this administration when it was with Syria, they missed an opportunity when there was the opportunity for dialogue, and then Syria started to do some things that really were outrageous in our judgment. I mean, I had the ambassador come to me and plead with me to, see if we could have some interaction. And I said, well, it's because you're doing things in Iraq. And he said, tell us whatever you're doing wrong and we'll stop. Whatever we're doing wrong, we'll stop. I said, yeah, we know 3 things you're doing wrong. You'll stop that. We want you to stop the other 7. And the problem is we get briefed about what they do, and they act like we don't know that they're doing it. So, I mean, what I wrestle with is, with this administration having failed to seize the advantage when there was an opportunity and it was lower level, and now things are hotter, do we then say, okay, let's do it, because then it seems to me we've just said to them, the more outrageous you become, the more we're going to, deal with you. Maybe, Mr. Hawes, you could do it, and I'd have others respond to my point. I wrestle with this.
Can I please just take? I think it's only fair though for me to be able to respond.
Hold on 1 second.
I'll make sure, Ms. Levitt, that you get time.
I'll make sure you'll get time, but I get to decide whether who answers questions. You've answered most to 90% of the questions. Mr. Haas?
Well, I certainly would not question any of the back and forth that they've been more involved in than I have, but I would suggest to you that there is a very big difference between temporary marriages of convenience between enemy states who see it within their joint interest to do something together at any one particular moment, like remove the Taliban, for instance, from Afghanistan, clearly in both nations' interests, and this question of a grand bargain where we both are going to set aside all of our differences. I differ, I suspect, with my colleagues because I go back to those more basic questions of the embassy seizure, the Hezbollah bombing of the Marine barracks, sanctioned by Iran, Khobar Towers, and things going all the way up to the present with the weapons and the money in Afghanistan.
But the question that arises
yes.
is, had we jumped in sooner, would those further things have happened? Could we have done something to change the direction of this country?
I believe that the Iranians have taken a series of messages from us that have been unhelpful, not responding as strongly as we might have with regard to the embassy takeover. Certainly, our response to the Marine barracks bombing, where we redeployed out of Beirut, was a signal to the Iranians. And I think I tend to agree with you. I think we are showing great tolerance, although some of the rhetoric has changed. We're showing great tolerance with regard to what the Revolutionary Guard, and I suspect with the approval of the highest level of the government, is doing to our troops in Iraq.
Thank you, Mr. House. I do want Mr. Wells to get a chance to answer his question. So Mr. Leverett and Ms. Leverett, that'd be fine with you, Mr. Shays. They will respond, but then we'll move to Mr. Wells.
I would like Ms. Maloney, Dr. Maloney, if she could just respond as well.
Dr. Leverett.
I would like to just ask a question. Let's assume that, in fact, everything that is claimed by some is true about the supply of IEDs by Iran to Shia militia groups in Iraq. Let's assume that is true.
I've seen them. I don't have to assume it. I've seen them.
Fine. Then in 1972, when President Nixon made his trip to China, people like Senator Webb in the other house have said that at that time, China was supplying weapons to the Viet Cong and to the North Vietnamese Army, and that Senator Webb and his comrades were being shot at, hurt, and killed by that weaponry. Was President Nixon wrong to go to Beijing under those circumstances?
No, but he wouldn't have denied that they were doing it. And you would have had more credibility with me, both of you, if you said, of course they're doing that, but we need to deal with it in a different way. That's where you would have had more credibility with
Mr. Shays, I'm going to just interject for a second, and of helping us all out here. With respect to that issue, I have somewhat of an advantage of serving on the Intelligence Committee as well, things that I can't talk about directly. But what I'll recommend to you with respect to the certainty or uncertainty of whether or not those IEDs, where they're manufactured, where they're delivered, and who's in charge of sending or not delivering them, I suggest perhaps you and I jointly send a letter to CENTCOM and the Department of Defense asking which United States casualties are from IEDs linked to Iran to determine whether or not they actually know. I think it will be instructive.
And Iraqi.
Right, exactly. But I think it will be instructive and helpful to you on that as well. And somewhat, I think, those questions do exist, and I think it's important for everybody to know that. Ms. Leverett.
Yes, thank you. I want to take issue with the idea that I wouldn't care to know. I think that's unfair. I do care to know. I do read and study and watch this very closely. And General Peter Pace, for example, someone who I worked with at the White House, who I have enormous respect for, publicly came out and questioned the administration's case when it was first laid out. I read that and I took it seriously. People should have had more skepticism as well before we went into Iraq on the issues of whether there were WMD and a nuclear weapons program in Iraq. And I don't think it is worthwhile to jump to judgment on something that I don't know, but I don't think it's right to say something about me not caring to know. I certainly do care to know. I take it seriously. Any American soldier who has lost his life because of anything that has to do with Iran, I think is wrong. My policy prescription may or may not be similar to yours, but it is not fair or right to say I don't care.
Fair enough.
Mr. Welch, you recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. I'm just reacting to the good grilling that my friend from Connecticut gave everybody and thinking about what your answers would have been in March of 2003 when the administration assured us with 100% certainty that there were weapons of mass destruction, and that was a known fact. So I, for one anyway, appreciate the old Reagan maxim of trust but verify. Mr. Haas, I'm interested in this question, whether you agree with Dr. Maloney, which I understood your testimony, Dr. Maloney, was that there is, as an option of dealing with the nuclear proliferation threat in Iran, serious threat, the military force is not a practical option.
Well, I'm not a military expert by any stretch of the imagination, but I would suggest that it does depend on what it is you're trying to accomplish through a military option. And if I could just stipulate that I'm not advocating a military option, if I could please stipulate that, because I know that that is a subject of some sensitivity for everyone involved in this debate, I would suggest to you that I don't know that there is a huge amount of doubt that the United States, alone or working in concert with its allies, could slow the nuclear program down, could complicate the nuclear program in Iran. I don't know that there's great doubt about that. Now, that leads into questions of regime change, which is not anything that I'm advocating. I do think at the end of the day, we are going to have to decide as a country, hopefully after we try all sorts of other things more seriously than we've tried them, like sanctions and public diplomacy and outreach and encouragement of democratic change. We are going to have to decide as a country whether it is more dangerous to acquiesce to an Iran with nuclear weapons or it's more dangerous to actually try to slow or end that program. And that's really for you to decide. I do have a perspective. I don't know that I know of anything more dangerous that I can envision as this regime with nuclear weapons.
All right. So unanswered question, because you say you don't have enough information, is whether the use of the military option would be effective.
It would be at least, I am confident that it would be at least somewhat effective in the sense of slowing the program down. Okay. I do not know that it would eliminate the program.
Okay. And what would be the collateral consequences of a military strike if we were to pursue that as a way of slowing it down?
There is great debate on what the reaction of the Iranian people would be. They clearly do not.
Here's what I ask you. If we're going to use, we've got a problem, and that is nuclear weapons possibly being in the hands of Iran. That's a threat.
Right.
Okay, agreement on that. And this isn't a moral or philosophical or theological question. There's a practical decision that has to be made where none of the choices that we will make are particularly good. And in this sense, I don't see there to be a difference in you and Dr. Leverett. Okay, you might come down on different sides of what's, quote, practical, but everyone up here would prefer to have a non-nuclear Iran. There is significant drumbeat that we use the nuclear option to slow or stop the threat to the extent it's there. If you make the decision to move ahead with the military, then you've got a responsibility, you, not you, but all of us,
right,
to, number one, have a very clear and informed conclusion opinion, really, about will this work? Number two, what are the consequences? Obviously, people did not go through that process in the whole Iraq war. There were collateral consequences to toppling Saddam that we were not prepared to deal with. So the question I have is, assuming we did use the military option in some form, and most people are talking about an airstrike, what would be the collateral consequences, those being the reaction in the Muslim world, the reaction in Iran, the threat to the security of our troops in Iraq, the intensification of Iran's support for Hamas or other third parties that would attack American interests in other parts of the world. And if you are even, if you, not you individually, but if one is entertaining a military option, I believe you would agree with me that they have to have answers to those questions. And I'm asking you.
Certainly, I would. Let me say a few things. First, I would agree that to the extent that there is any reluctance on the part of Iran to unleash its terrorist clients in more aggressive ways, I would have to conclude that that reluctance would disappear. Having said that, with regard to the region, I would like to point something out. There is great fear throughout that region about the Iran nuclear program.
Right.
For many years, those nations in the region assume that Israel has nuclear weapons. I think there's a general assumption that it does, although it has not admitted it. None of those countries, other than Iraq, had a nuclear program in the past. Right now, we know that at least 10 nations in that region, including Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, and Turkey, have announced that they will have a nuclear program, although they've said it's for peaceful purposes, but nobody believes it. Right. They are worried about the Iranians. I would suggest to you that the reaction in Iran may be one, in the region may be one of quiet relief if we slow down that program. Having said that, I would expect there to be some level of turmoil from the simple fact that there is military action in that region and it's by the United States. I would expect there to be some turmoil. But at the end of the day, Congressman, it's a trade-off. What is more dangerous, the turmoil that you create or the regime with nuclear weapons? And I worry, I suppose, a bit about the latter.
Well, no, which we all do.
Thank you, Mr. Welch.
Thank you.
Mr. Moran from Virginia. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Cheney. I'd like to focus on, for the time being, on Ambassador Dobbins, but I had to go over and speak on the bill on the floor. So has anybody grilled the ambassador yet?
He's got off pretty easy, but he's had some good comments to make.
Well, now it's his turn then. I know you know, Mr. Chairman, that Ambassador Dobbins has phenomenal experience, and they send him to just about every trouble area no one else in their right mind would want to go to: Bosnia, Kosovo, Haiti, Somalia, you name it. And Afghanistan is one of those. So I'd like to get I've read the article in Esquire by Mr. and Mrs. Leverett. I was extraordinarily impressed. So I don't know that I need to ask them questions, but I'd like to pursue something with Ambassador Dobbins. I'm obviously going on here as I'm looking for the right questions. First of all, some yes and no answers would be appropriate. The Northern Alliance were our allies when we went into Afghanistan. In fact, the leader of the Northern Alliance is the guy that we were anticipating working with, because he was very much allied with the United States. Was Iran helping the Northern Alliance?
Yes.
They were. Did Iran contemplate going to war with the Afghani Taliban?
At one point, when some of their diplomats were seized and killed.
So they were in the same position that we were, that the United States was, but before the United States, in terms of recognizing the repressive policies of the Taliban. Did our special forces work with Iranian troops or agents in Afghanistan in the Afghan war when we went to war with the Taliban?
Not directly that I know of.
Did they coordinate in any way?
I don't believe that there was good diplomatic coordination. There was some intelligence coordination. I don't believe there was any direct military coordination.
Were they of any consequence in our prevailing in that war against the Taliban?
I think that their contribution was, on the one hand, having sustained the Northern Alliance for most of a decade, and continuing to sustain it, to pay it, to train it, and to support it during the conflict, including after 9/11, and then directly on the diplomatic side, in which they did collaborate with us quite effectively.
Now, after the major hostilities were concluded, obviously they're still going on, but we needed to put a government together. Iran knew the language, they knew many of the people, they had been involved more, they were a neighbor of Afghanistan. Did they offer to help us put together a stable government that would work with the United States?
They did, and they brokered some of the key compromises that led to the success of the Bonn Conference, where the Karzai government was selected.
How about putting together the kind of Afghan army that government that we would want to establish would need in order to restore order and maintain order?
They offered cooperation, but the U.S. didn't pick up the offer.
Yeah, what was the form of that cooperation, Ambassador? What did they offer to do for the United States?
They said they were prepared to train and equip up to 20,000 Afghan recruits under a program to be directed by the United States.
Did you communicate that to Washington, the decision makers in the Bush administration?
Yes.
And what was the response?
There was no interest in picking up the offer.
I guess you wouldn't be necessarily one to ask, but since you're aware of this, which most people don't seem to be, would that have made a material difference in terms of the stabilization of Afghanistan?
I think they could have made a contribution. Our own efforts to train the Afghan National Army stumbled rather badly that first year, and we had to start all over again a year later. But I think that the offer was even more important for its symbolism, for a willingness to come out of the closet and work overtly with the United States in a practical way on a military-to-military level and in a clearly subordinate position.
We went into Afghanistan because al-Qaeda attacked us. Did Iran express an interest, either by words or by actions, in defeating al-Qaeda or in showing solidarity with our objectives against al-Qaeda?
Yes, they issued supportive statements after 9/11 and indicated a willingness to cooperate with us both in the military campaign and in the diplomacy.
Thank you, Mr. Moran.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have one further question.
Go ahead.
Who was aware of the fact that in terms of the decision makers we would recognize, who knew that Iran was helping to restrain al-Qaeda, to defeat al-Qaeda, really?
I believe the administration as a whole was aware of that.
When you say the administration, could you name anybody in particular that you know was briefed on that fact, on Iran's positive role in Afghanistan?
All of the NSC principals, Secretaries of State, Defense, White
Secretary
House, National
Rumsfeld,
Security
Secretary
Advisor.
Rice,
Yes.
Secretary Powell.
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Moran. Thank you for joining us today. Mr. McDermott, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for having this hearing. In an article on Sunday in the McClatchy Washington Bureau entitled Experts, quote, "No firm evidence of Iranian nuclear weapons," Mr. al-Baradei is quoted as saying, "I have not received any information that there is concrete active nuclear weapons program going on right now." Now, everyone sort of jumps at that right now. The press also has been, for the last 3 or 4 months, 6 months maybe, carrying reports of special forces operating inside of Iran. Do you know about whether that's true? If it is, under what kind of a finding, or what is the basis for us operating in Iran with any kind of military operation? Does anybody?
Can I just speak to that as the person who's most recently served, at least at the State Department? I think that's a question that's obviously best asked to the administration, and probably in another sort of setting than this one.
Anybody have anything to say about it?
I won't duck that one, Congressman. I obviously know nothing by way of classified information on this, or I couldn't speak about it in this setting. I, like you, have seen the press reports about U.S. military personnel operating in Afghanistan. It has long been the approach.
In Afghanistan?
I'm sorry,
Iran.
in Iran. I'm sorry, I misspoke. In Iran, it was certainly the policy of the Defense Department under Secretary Rumsfeld that U.S. military forces could be used for such purposes without requiring the normal kind of covert action finding, which would, under normal circumstances, have to be briefed at least to the oversight committees on the Hill. Whether that is in fact what is happening in the case of Iran today, I don't know what the facts are, but it is certainly plausible to me that U.S. military forces could be operating inside Iran under the rubric of collecting intelligence or some other similar rubric, and it would be the position of the Defense Department, unless policy is changed, that action would not require a covert action finding.
And who would make that decision that it didn't require a covert action finding? Would that be the Secretary or the President, or?
I would assume at a minimum that the theater commander and the Secretary of Defense would need to sign off on that. Whether it goes higher, I couldn't say.
Is there any basis on which they could be in there without the committees of the Congress, the Intelligence Committee or whatever, being made aware that they are collecting data on targets for an air war?
I believe that the Defense Department could and might have made a claim that under those circumstances, collecting intelligence, preparing the battlefield, that covert action findings are not required, and therefore it wouldn't have to be briefed to the oversight committees.
I ask the question because it's very strange what's gone on in Syria, where there was an attack and the American government doesn't want to say anything, and the Syrians don't want to say anything, and the Israelis don't want to say anything. But the stories are coming out now that there were, in fact, operatives on the ground directing the bombing that occurred there. And is that a tactic that's used?
I mean, certainly my understanding is that for tactical air operations of that sort, from a military standpoint, the accuracy, the effectiveness of those operations is improved if you can have on the ground spotters. Whether or not that is actually what happened in the case of the Israeli air raid on the Syrian target, I couldn't say. Because I don't know.
So what they do is they put a laser or something so that laser guided bombs will come in exactly on the spot that they want them to?
I don't know precisely what technologies are used, but my understanding is that it increases the accuracy and effectiveness of those kinds of tactical air operations if you can have people on the ground.
Would you give us I'd like to hear all the panel, if they will, give us their percentage on whether there will be a air attack in the next 9 months. Ambassador?
There is in fact a commercially run pool on this, and the last
pool managers right in front of me,
and it was 38% last week was what it was running, 38% that there would be over the next. I think that was over the next 12 months. I would put it a little lower than that because it seems so obviously counterproductive. But what do I know? I didn't think they'd be foolish enough to go into Iraq. So,
Mrs. Penn?
I would put up for a 9-month period, I'd put it at about 50%. Over a 9-month period, I would put it at about 50%, and that would be based on my analysis that the diplomatic process is collapsing and the president will be faced with a binary choice.
I'd agree with that over 9 months. I don't think it's going to happen tomorrow or next month, but if this continues to play out over a 9-month time frame, I think the odds will increase, and I'd put them at about 50-50.
Mr. Haas?
I don't strongly disagree with that. I was going to say, before they started talking, I was going to say 40 to 50% over the next 9 months or so.
It's good to be finally in a position of saying something controversial on this discussion, and I would put it at about 15 to 20%. That's based on my experience in the State Department working very closely with Secretary and particularly with Undersecretary Burns on Iran. Obviously, that's a biased view because, of course, the State Department is in the art of diplomacy. But I would also argue that if you look at the Bush administration's track record over its now almost 2 full terms in office, what you see is an increasing reversal in its positions, particularly on the nuclear program. And so while the negotiations have obviously gone nowhere, I think it's far more likely that the administration will seek to find some sort of way, desperate way, to try to get some sort of negotiating track underway. I would also argue that the administration perceives itself to be far too invested in Iraq and, in recent weeks, far too invested in some sort of prospect of restarting the Israeli-Palestinian peace process to go the route of bombing because of the obvious implications it would have for those two efforts. And I say all this having been someone who in 2002, 2003 was 100% sure that the administration would go into Iraq.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. McDermott. Dr. Maloney, you're the one with the most recent insight into this administration. You were a policy planning staff member from 2005 right through 2007. So can you tell us what your confidence level is about the current executive branch policymakers' understanding of Iran?
Well, I think that's a perennial issue. Unfortunately, because of the lack of contacts and because of the lack of an embassy, we simply have very little ability to understand what's happening inside the country. Secretary Rice has acknowledged that publicly in an interview she gave earlier this year where she just said, we just don't know. It was shocking to me to come in 2005 and realize that there was effectively almost no one in the entire State Department building who spoke Persian who worked on Iran. That effectively remains the case. I would say that one of the positive things that the administration has done is try to build capabilities in this arena. There has been the establishment of an Office of Iranian Affairs run by competent professionals, foreign service officers, and there's been the establishment of an office out in Dubai led by people who very much do understand Iran, have been working on this issue for quite a long time. That office, unfortunately described by Undersecretary Burns at one point as a kind of Riga station, which evoked a lot of concerns among Iranians, is very much intended to serve in some ways as a shadow embassy. It has political officers, economic officers, people who do public diplomacy. The officers stationed there try as much as possible to meet with Iranians. So we're operating in a tremendous disadvantage that is really born of the lack of contacts and the lack of exposure to Iran, and frankly the restrictions on Americans traveling to Iran, which are really not within the U.S. government's purview. I think one of the unfortunate constraints is the restrictions on dialogue that have expanded under this administration, but I think any administration for the foreseeable future is going to have a long difficulty building back from this deficit of understanding.
Thank you. Now I just want to ask you, I was listening to a little bit of the back and forth here, and Mr. Haas, you indicate that you're not for the military option on this, that you're not recommending people go in and bomb or have a military option. But it sounds like you're heavily into the sanctions without discussion mode. And I guess if that's the case, you must be thinking that they're going to lead to some sort of regime change, and that's your ulterior motive. And I juxtapose that against what I hear from others who don't discount the sanctions, or at least it seems to me that they don't discount the sanctions. They see them as an effective tool in our toolkit, but who say that they must be, amongst other things, that we're willing to negotiate about as we try to get some concessions out of the Iranians. So I just put that to the panel. You should answer first, sir, because I brought your name up first, but I'd like to hear from the others as well. Because, one of our witnesses last week talked about the importance of Iran to a host of our national security priorities, Afghanistan, Iraq, Pakistan, nuclear nonproliferation, right on down the list.
Well, a few thoughts. First of all, it comes down to what you fear may happen down the road. And so I start from the premise that what I fear most is this regime with nuclear weapons. So then dialing back from that, you say, what is it that we can try that perhaps will avert that situation? And I think that we have some tools that we have not used as forcefully as we could. They include carrots and sticks, but I don't think they're carrots to the Iranian regime because I don't think we can get a grand bargain with them. I think they are carrots to the Iranian people where we do not have the ties and we are not providing the support that we can. I would separate as best we can the regime from the Iranian people, and I see sanctions and this more comprehensive strategy as an alternative to military action, and hopefully it will work if we do it aggressively.
So am I correct in characterizing your position that you would use these tools to affect some sort of regime change by moving to the people and getting them to toss them out? That's your end goal of your policy?
Yes, my end goal is to isolate. You don't want to change
behavior of the people that are in government now. You just want to change the government, and you want to use the sanctions or whatever else you got in your box to do that.
If the sanctions were to lead to a situation where the Iranian people forced behavior change, that would be great.
What if they led to a situation where the acting government now said, we'll do behavior change? We'll make the grand bargain. Is that out of your realm where you say no because it's you that we don't like? We're not going to tolerate that. We just want to get rid of you?
I'm skeptical that will
I know
come
you are,
to
but
pass.
what if it happened?
Then fantastic. If it were to come to pass,
so
obviously.
In essence, you're not that far away from what others are talking about. They're talking about doing the same thing, of using these tools to change the behavior.
Mr. Chairman, I am not for regime change for the sake of regime change.
Okay, that's what I'm trying to get at.
That's right. I want an end goal. I don't want this regime to have nuclear weapons.
Right. Fine. And that's what I was getting at. I have to tell you, I clearly took your position at first to be you just wanted to get rid of them because you had this belief that they would never change. And I wanted to know whether or not, in fact, if they did change behavior, whether you and those that you associate with recommend and work with or whatever, we're still saying that's not good enough, we just want to get rid of you. I think you've clarified that, and I appreciate it. The other witnesses may want to make a comment on that, where we're going with this thing, in terms of, I don't know that anybody is looking to say that regime change is the idea, is behavior change that we want, and there's a role for sanctions to be used as part of the toolkit on that. Am I right in characterizing others' position? Ambassador?
Look, we have a diplomatic mission in Havana. Cuba has a diplomatic mission in Washington. Why are we talking to Castro and not talking to the Iranian regime? Now, I take Mr. Shea's point that that there's a certain loss of face involved and conceding something now that we were unprepared to concede when they were behaving better. And the lesson I draw from that is don't put yourself in that position to start with. Don't say I'm going to hold my breath until you agree with me, because it just becomes progressively more difficult to sustain, and it's not likely to make them agree. I think we need to use the full spectrum of tools available to us, but I don't think we can possibly succeed unless we understand them better, and we're not going to understand them better unless we talk to them.
Ms. Levitt, Mr. Levitt.
Yeah, I would point out we've had nearly 30 years of sanctions on the Iranian regime, and it has not really worked. It has not been effective to change their behavior. I think part of the problem is, in my experience with dealing with them, both as part of the official dialogue from 2001 to 2003, and then after I left government in the Track 2 opportunities I've had to see some senior Iranian officials, The problem with the continuing ratcheting up of the sanctions is that I think the Iranians also don't think that it will be effective, and it cuts to the core of what they want from us, which is essentially a version of a security guarantee that we are not going to use force to change their form of government or borders. And so the continuing ratcheting up of the sanctions, I think, undermines precisely the carrot that they want from us. I don't think that they're all that excited about WTO accession with a U.S. impromptu on it, or the delivery of airline parts or other kind of small carrots that this administration has been willing to put forward. That's not enough. What they're looking for from us, and only from us, this is not something they could get from the Europeans. They negotiated with the Europeans on the nuclear issue for 2 years. The Europeans cannot give the security guarantee that they're looking for. Only the United States could do that. And the ratcheting of sanctions, I'm not against them per se, but in this case, it undermines the core need that the Iranians are looking to have from us.
Dr. Levitt, now that you have sanctions, they're an effective tool in moving forward to the grand bargain or not?
No, I don't think they're an effective tool. Neither unilateral sanctions nor multilateral sanctions of the degree that we would be able to get agreement on is likely to have any strategic effect on this regime. The only thing that's going to work is to put an offer in front of the Iranians that will actually address core interests that matter to them. We have not done that. No administration has ever done that. This administration has refused to do that, and to document that, I would suggest that you take the incentives package that this administration signed on to last year with the other permanent members of the Security Council in Germany, put that next to the incentives package that the Europeans on their own offered to the Iranians a year earlier. The language on economic and technological cooperation is very similar. The big differences are on regional security issues. The Europeans on their own were prepared to offer all kinds of implicit, explicit security guarantees for Iran. This administration insisted that those passages in the European draft be taken out before it would sign on. So Secretary Rice can say the policy is not regime change, but the actions of this administration indicate to the Iranians that the policy is in fact regime change, and the President himself has never been willing to make the statement that Secretary Rice has made about U.S. policy. The only way out of this is to make the Iranians an offer that serves our interests but also serves theirs.
Thank you. Dr. Maloney, you want the last word on that? I'll go to Mr. Shays.
I'd love it, although I think I've lost track of exactly what the question is. The effectiveness of sanctions, I think we've seen over the past 30 years that unilateral sanctions have only moderate effectiveness. What the administration has done in recent months through these financial measures can have some real bite because it's effectively forcibly multilateral, because third country banks need to engage with the U.S. financial system. Therefore, they're effectively cooperating, participating in some of the restrictions on the U-turns that would enable Iran to do business in U.S. dollars. That is increasingly no longer the case, and the Iranians are feeling the impact. I don't believe that those sorts of measures are going to create a reversal in the Iranian strategic calculus. So I think what you have to ask yourself is what will, that so long as Iran is getting $70 billion in oil revenues, these sorts of measures can hurt, but they can't force a full-fledged change, and we are unlikely to get multilateral consensus around the kind of robust measures that actually would force a change. I think this whole question of regime change, which is to some extent a separate question and gets to Mr. Shays' question about how can we negotiate with this particular set of characters, is also an important one, and I think the open question about where the administration stands in terms of regime change, the ambiguities that have been left, are particularly important and need to be dealt with. The difficulty here is that there still are divisions, and also that this is very much a complicated and difficult regime to deal with from their end. But ultimately, we put the handcuffs on ourselves in refusing to talk to them from 2003 and 2006. We continue to have handcuffs on our engagement with Iran because we're trying to find some way to make this overture with the nuclear program somehow viable. Ultimately, what we need to do at this stage is negotiations on all issues without preconditions. That's not an offer of a grand bargain, and it's not necessarily a road to one, but it is a fresh start, a possibility of working on all the issues that we care about.
Thank you very much. Mr. Shays.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It may not appear this way, but I really enjoy this panel, all of you, and I appreciate the incredible experience that each of you have had. And I truly wrestle with all the things you're wrestling with, but without the knowledge that you may have. What I want to ask is this. I had the Israelis say to me, you don't understand the Middle East culture. You have a Western mindset. And for years, I wanted them to get out of Lebanon. And they said, you don't understand. We got out of Lebanon, and it will be a different reaction than you think. Well, they got out of Lebanon, and it was confirmation, Arafat, that they could just wear Israel down. It had the exact opposite thing I thought the impact would be. And the Intifada happened, and they just went in that direction, convinced, like in Lebanon, they could wear them down. So I want to ask, is there a Middle East mindset that is different than the Western mindset? And as we dialogue about how we should just talk, I don't mean just talk, but have dialogue, does it say something different to them than it says to us? And I'd like to start with you, Dr. Maloney. Excuse me, you haven't been responding to most questions, but you're the most recent on all this stuff. And then I'd like to go to you, Ambassador, and ask the others.
I would not purport to suggest that there is a Middle Eastern mindset, or frankly even an Iranian mindset, which of course would inevitably be to some extent distinct from an Arab or an Israeli mindset. I think what we know about this particular set of leaders in Iran today is that they fear compromise. They fear compromise, and they've said it publicly, because they see any sort of concession or agreement to deal with the United States or make offers as only the starting point of some sort of future round of new pressures. Senior officials have used the phrase, you know, today it's nuclear rights, tomorrow it will be human rights, the day after that it will be animal rights. Effectively, their fear is regime survival. Okay. And they are a nasty group of people. There's no question about it.
Do you believe the mindset? I mean, when I heard Ms. Mann Levitt basically saying sanctions didn't work, I would agree that unilateral sanctions don't ever hardly work. But we've never seen true multilateral sanctions. And when I'm struck by the fact that President Bush, Senator Hillary Clinton, President Nicholas Sarkozy, Chancellor Angela Merkel all said totally unacceptable for Iran to have nuclear weapons. Well, I don't know what totally unacceptable means. It seems to me you have talk, you have sanctions, or you use military. And those are the three options. And I've seen nothing that tells me that talk, well, first off, I don't know, to what extent we've had, I don't know what works. But it strikes me that talk would work the least. I thought Jimmy Carter did a lot of talking, and then I saw Ronald Reagan say, we're going to treat taking embassy employees as an act of war, and they were returned right away. It said to me that, they think differently, or maybe the same in some ways.
I don't think this is a question of their thought process, though. The problem with multilateral sanctions is that we simply can't get agreement on them from our international partners.
So if we can't get multilateral agreement, in spite of the fact that the Chancellor of Germany and the President of France say, it's unacceptable, well, how the heck do you prevent them from having it? And I just would throw out here, I'm stunned by the fact that there was an event in Syria to which Israel appeared to have taken action. Since I haven't been briefed on anything, don't know it, I can at least talk about it. I'm struck by this fascination that in Syria something happened, and it wasn't talk. But, Ambassador, let me have you respond to this.
In my diplomatic career, I've dealt with Soviet apparatchiks, Somali warlords, Caribbean dictators, Balkan terrorists, Afghan insurgents, and Iranian diplomats. And of those,
you have a wife?
Yes, and I see her occasionally. And of those, I actually found the Iranians the most reasonable. But that's, I guess what I would say is that any negotiation has to proceed from an understanding of the other side's perspectives, history, expectations, and they vary greatly. And if you're going to deal with Iran, you do have you will do better if you have a deep understanding. And some of the points you raise are absolutely valid ones. On the other hand, I think all negotiations are similar in other respects, which is they need to be based on a certain degree of mutual respect. A certain agreement about what it is you're negotiating about, and a shared sense that if you pursue this professionally and seriously, you have a prospect of reaching your common goal.
Let me just go with you, Ms. Levitt, Dr. Levitt, and then we'll end with Mr. Hawes, and I'll conclude.
I can say in terms of my experience with the Iranians negotiating with them, in terms of their mentality, that I thought that when we asked them something, it appeared that they tried to deliver on everything that we asked. As I said in the record, that their performance was not perfect, but they did deliver much of what we asked. I don't think that we have tried to have a serious discussion with them about the nuclear issue. I do believe, from what I've been able to ascertain and people I've talked to on the Iranian side, that the pursuit of a nuclear weapons option is based on regime survival. And if it's based on regime survival, even if we were to militarily strike it, I think that would further add concern to them that the regime survival is at risk, and it would harden the mentality and force the program either to go underground or further underground, depending on where you come out in terms of where the program is.
Just quickly, are sanctions and talk mutually exclusive?
Well, what I see is the problem with I wouldn't unilaterally disarm from the United States. I wouldn't say we're going to lift the sanctions today without having any kind of any roadmap or grand bargain out there on the table. But ratcheting up the sanctions now, like to designate the Rev Guard, ratcheting up the sanction directly undermines the concern the regime has about its survivability. That's the problem with ratcheting up the unilateral sanctions by the United States at this point.
Let me have Mr. Hawes just respond quickly, because has Jim got questions? Are we all done? Okay, so let me...
Very quickly to your first question. I do think there is something important that you say about Lebanon. If you read the literature, if you listen to the speeches from that part of the world, you will see leaders in Iran as well as elsewhere talking about the Israelis leaving Lebanon, the Americans redeploying after Beirut, and the Americans in particular leaving Somalia after engagements in which Americans were bloodied. So there is something to what you're saying. Now, to go to the question about the tactics and the three things that you say, talk, sanctions, or military action, I would just like to point out that we have been terribly disjointed in the messages that we have sent. We have said, as you say, that an Iran with nuclear weapons is not acceptable. Our leaders have said it, and at the same time, Secretary Rice, in assuring Western audiences, said Iran is not Iraq, meaning we're not going to use military force. My colleagues may disagree with me, but I think that when you send a signal to someone who you are trying to get to change in some way, that the option that will really hurt them the most is not on the table anymore, it seems to me that undercuts your negotiation. And I think that we have not done a very good job of making clear that, yes, we will talk. Absolutely, we will be reasonable. Hopefully, we will come to an accommodation that suits both sides. But taking options off the table or being so disjointed about the messages we send, I think makes it less effective, less likely that we're going to succeed with those other tools at our disposal. Thank you.
Thank you. I have two quick things before we adjourn. First, I hope this can be quick. Is there any example we have in during the last 25, 28 years, in which the Iranians have conducted what we would normally regard as normal negotiations, successful negotiations with any other country?
The Iranians have maintained diplomatic relations with just about every other country in the world. So in terms of normal negotiations, they do that every day. I think you can find lots of examples of Iran behaving pragmatically in its foreign policy. The primary one that academics like to cite is Saudi Arabia. The relationship between Iran and Saudi Arabia was really bitter and acrimonious, particularly after the first decade of the revolution. And Khomeini, in his will, basically castigated King Fahd and the Saudis far more than he did America. And yet what has happened since 1989 has been a progressive and even still to this day devoted effort by the Iranians to try to build a rapprochement with the Saudis that has maintained even with some of the frictions that have been created by Ahmadinejad. So
Thank you.
that's
So
an example.
They do know how to do it. That's reassuring. Secondly, and this is going to be the subject of it, we're going to pursue this an additional hearing according to Chairman Tierney, but in regard to the censorship of your op-ed piece, you submitted the op-ed piece after you had left government. That's correct. Under what basis did the government, the White House, censor your piece? What authority did they have to do that?
As we said, both the State Department and the CIA told us independently their in-house reviews said this draft contained no classified information, but that the White House was simply asserting that it should be classified. There was never any justification that was presented to us.
I understand, but you wrote the op-ed piece.
Yes.
And you were private citizens at that point.
Yes.
And you could have sent it to the New York Times anyway. Why would how would the White House be able to prevent you from doing that?
In my case, as a former CIA employee, I have a continuing obligation to submit drafts of material that I want to publish that relate to my government service, to submit those to the agency to ensure, after an agency review, that draft is not disclosing classified information. I've cleared 30 pieces
so the
through
CIA,
that process.
in this case, the CIA cleared it, but then the White House said that they couldn't.
And then the White House told the CIA that they had to become involved in the process and that they would not clear it.
All right. Well, the chairman has asked me to mention that we would be examining that further. I also want to announce on Chairman Tierney's behalf that we will continue this series of hearings on Iran next Wednesday, November 14th at 2 p.m. The hearing then will examine the regional and global